Ilya Malinin stands alone on this planet as the only human being who has ever landed a quad axel in official competition, a jump that requires 4.5 rotations in the air from a forward takeoff edge that forces an extra half spin no other jump demands. For decades, the quad axel was considered the 4-minute mile of figure skating, mathematically possible in theory, but completely untouchable in practice. The kind of achievement that sports scientists and biomechanics researchers had spent years arguing might sit permanently outside the range of what human biology could actually execute. In September 2022, an 18-year-old kid from Virginia landed it at a sanctioned international competition. Footage of the jump went viral to millions of people who had never watched a single figure skating event in their lives. And every comment section filled with the same reaction from every corner of the internet at the same moment. The reaction was not celebration. It was disbelief. It was people typing, "This is fake," and "How is this even real?" which is the specific kind of response that only happens when something genuinely exceeds every existing reference point a human brain has for what is physically possible.
Ilya was essentially born into this sport as the son of Roman and Tatiana Malinin, both world-class competitive skaters whose careers established a baseline that most athletes would consider the summit of a lifetime of work rather than a starting point. When you're the child of elite athletes, the bar does not begin at the bottom where everyone else starts. It begins exactly where your parents left off, and the world around you treats your eventual greatness not as a possibility to be earned, but as an obligation to be fulfilled on schedule. By his early teens, coaches were using the kind of language they typically reserve for once-in-a-generation legends rather than junior competitors, describing his air control and spatial instincts in terms that suggested they were watching something that did not follow the normal developmental curve of a young skater. He was not just a prospect with potential. He was being positioned in the public conversation as a once-in-a-century phenomenon before he had even competed at the senior international level, which is a weight that would fracture most people before they ever got close to the achievement it describes.
After the quad axel landed in competition and the footage detonated across the internet, the pressure surrounding Ilya did not gradually build the way pressure normally builds around a young athlete developing through the ranks of a sport. It exploded immediately and completely because he had done the thing that everyone in skating had spent decades saying was impossible. And suddenly, every single competition he entered became a test of whether the impossible moment had been real or whether it was a one-time anomaly that would never be repeated. The conversations about the 2026 Milan Winter Olympics started appearing in every interview and every article about him almost immediately, turning a long-term athletic goal into a daily weight that he carried into every training session and every competitive appearance on the calendar. This is the side of elite sports that stays completely invisible to the people watching from the outside, because the crowd sees the landing and misses the 3 in the morning anxiety, sees the gold medal and misses the experience of having an entire national narrative resting on the shoulders of a teenager who did not ask to be a savior.
Ilya has spoken openly about the soul-crushing accumulation of stress that builds when the world collectively decides that you are the person responsible for the future of your sport, and the specific way that kind of pressure transforms from something that drives you into something that traps you. His answer to that pressure, the thing that kept him functional and competitive and mentally intact through the most intense period of expectation the sport had ever placed on a single young athlete, was not what anyone covering elite sports performance would have predicted or recommended. It was not a new coaching structure. It was not a training overhaul. It was not a high-priced sports psychologist with a sophisticated methodology built around managing competitive anxiety at the elite level. It was video games, built into his daily routine with genuine discipline and treated not as a mindless distraction, but as a calculated mental reset tool that gave his nervous system a reliable path from high-stakes competitive pressure to complete recovery mode.
The science behind what Malin was doing instinctively before any professional told him to do it is called cognitive disengagement.
and it is one of the most consistently underestimated tools in the entire field of elite sports performance management. The human brain cannot sustain peak cognitive and physical output without genuine downtime. And genuine downtime does not mean sitting in silence replaying your mistakes or lying in a hotel room running through the disaster scenarios that appear uninvited in the mind of every high-level competitor. It means entering an environment where the stakes are deliberately low, where mistakes do not carry consequences that follow you into the next day, and where your competitive instincts can find an outlet that does not drain the same reserves the actual competition demands. For Ilya, video games became that environment, a space where he could engage and strategize and compete without the gravitational weight of Olympic timelines and world record expectations pressing down on every decision he made.
The correlation between Malinin taking his downtime seriously and his scores reaching a level of consistency that the sport had never seen from a competitor his age is not a coincidence that requires elaborate explanation. The exact moment he began treating recovery as a non-negotiable component of his preparation, rather than a luxury he would allow himself when there was nothing else to do, is the same period when his performances stopped fluctuating and started delivering at what can only be described as an inhuman level of reliability. This is peak performance science arrived at by a teenager through intuition and self-awareness before any institutional sports science operation handed him the methodology, which makes it more credible rather than less because it came from lived experience rather than a theoretical framework applied from the outside. Elite sport has spent decades worshiping the mythology of the tortured champion who sacrifices everything, who never rests, who treats any moment away from the training facility as a personal failure. And Malinin's approach is a direct and documented rebuttal of every part of that mythology. The athletes who changed the conversation about mental health in elite competition, Simone Biles stepping back at the Tokyo Olympics, Michael Phelps speaking publicly about the psychological cost of chasing gold at the level he chased it, created space for a younger generation to be honest about what the internal war actually costs. Malinin is the next chapter of that conversation, not because he experienced a public breakdown or a dramatic withdrawal that forced the sport to pay attention, but because he found a working solution and talked about it without shame, while still competing at the highest level the sport has ever seen. He is standing in front of an audience and saying directly that this is how he keeps his head straight. This is the specific thing that allows him to show up every day and do what no other human on earth can do. And the results on the ice are the evidence that the approach is working. In a sports culture that sells the grind as the only path to greatness and treats any deviation from total immersion as weakness, that simple act of naming a video game as the tool that saved his competitive career is a more radical statement than any technical achievement he has ever put on a scoreboard.
The athletes who master the ability to genuinely reset, to walk away from the arena completely and return to it restored rather than depleted, do not just win today, they survive the length of a career in a sport that is historically brutal about consuming its young stars and leaving behind the damage. Malinin is already playing the long game at an age when most athletes are still figuring out how to manage the short one, building habits into his preparation that are designed to protect his gift long enough to reach the full height of what that gift is capable of producing. The quad axel in September 2022 put his name in the record books permanently and introduced him to a global audience that had never considered watching figure skating before. But his willingness to be transparent about the internal struggle and the simple, unglamorous habit that keeps him human will be the thing that outlasts any jump. Talent at the elite level is not rare in the way people outside sport imagine it to be. What is genuinely rare is the combination of talent and the self-awareness to protect it. And at 20 years old, Ilya Malinin already has both in a way that suggests the sport has not yet seen his ceiling.